And I think that everyone who engages in a creative endeavor of any kind, it is a journey that is unfolding over time. All of us are having life journeys that are unfolding over time, and creativity is an important aspect of that.
Wise words from today's guest, Dr. Jonathan Feinstein. I've invited him today to talk about his research on the creative lives of some of the most exceptional creators, including Virginia Woolf, Thomas Edison, Steve Jobs, and artists like Alexander Calder and Henri Matisse. Dr. Feinstein is an economist in Yale's School of Management. His title is the John G. Searle Professor of Economics and Management. Now, that really is an unusual background for a creativity researcher, and I really love that because it gives them a new and unique perspective on how people become creative and on how they realize their creativity in their work and in their lives. I really enjoyed this interview, and I think you will too. I'm here with Dr. Jonathan Feinstein. He's an expert on creativity and innovation, and I'm really honored to have him on the show. Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you so much, Keith. It's my privilege to be on your show with you today.
I think I've read just about everything you've written, and certainly your 2 books about creativity and innovation. And I think you have a little bit of a unique perspective, and it contributes a lot to the field. So could you tell us about your perspective on creativity and innovation?
I think it's because I've come into the field from a different path, and it's led me to approach it from some different perspectives. In general, I think of creativity as a creative journey. And I think that everyone who engages in a creative endeavor of any kind, it is a journey that is unfolding over time. All of us are having life journeys that are unfolding over time, and creativity is an important aspect of that. So that for me, I think from the beginning, it's been about how can we understand what is happening along this journey that eventually leads someone to be able to make contributions that they feel good about, possibly that the world also feels good about or recognizes for its creativity. So that's kind of how I approach it. I should say I've had very much of my own life journey to get here, which is probably worth mentioning, just because it's important for people to know that there's so many different pathways that we can follow. Actually, my earliest ideas about this, I think, happened when I was 18 or 19 years old in college. And I wrote a couple of papers in some classes, a little bit along these lines, but had no idea what I was doing, to be quite honest. And the people around me also didn't seem to have a clue what I was talking about. So I thought, well, I'm not sure what to do with this right now. Honestly, this interest goes back even earlier, probably goes back to growing up. I always was fascinated by biographies or journals. I remember reading the journals of Lewis and Clark and thinking, wow, that's so fascinating that this group of people could be going on this expedition, and it's this unique trip that they're taking. So it goes back a long ways. But having said that, I really put it aside for a number of years. I went into the field of economics. I think that was partly because I've always been drawn to doing more formal mathematical modeling, which is another way in which I'm a little bit different in the creativity sphere, I think,
right,
than many people. Did well in economics and was doing fine with that. And a year or two out of graduate school, I kind of said to myself, I think I need to figure out what I really want to say, because if I don't figure it out, I'm never going to get it done. And so what that did was it launched into a period of a number of years of reading very broadly. That was really where I got my sort of second education, read a lot of philosophy, read quite a lot of psychology and many other fields, really was sort of sifting around, thinking about what is the direction I want to take. And that was not so easy. It's a very broad exploration that I was engaged in. Eventually, a few years down the road, I was able to put my finger on it. Actually, it was a book that I read at that time, a particular book. I realized, wow, what I want to do is study how each individual comes to make the unique contribution that they make. That's what I wanted to do. As soon as I understood that, I realized it connected back to the earlier ideas I'd had back in college, but I don't think I'd made that connection before then. That started me off on a path of development. First, I thought, well, I'll just model this and see how this goes. And after about almost a year, I realized, wow, I don't know what I'm doing here. And that was when I decided, okay, I think what I'll do is I will talk to people engaged in creative endeavors and let's see what they say they think they're doing. Seemed like a good empirical strategy. I know you've done things like that, so you can recognize the value of that approach. And I interviewed a lot of people about their creative work, a lot of people who had recently gotten doctorates in a variety of fields, literature, neuroscience, mathematics. I interviewed some playwrights, some filmmakers. And it was really out of that work that I eventually began to put together a framework, which led to my first book, The Nature of Creative Development.
Right, right.
I think it's a book you know well, so you can certainly quiz me on it.
I'm holding it right now, yes.
It's a big one. And it was really about trying to at least articulate a little bit about what is this framework of these creative journeys as a process of development look like. I should just stay, stepping back just a bit, a lot of people who study creativity, a lot of people in the world, I think, that you talk to about creativity, they tend to think about it as like a moment of inspiration or insight. Characteristically, we think of it as like the light bulb suddenly turning on or
Right,
the
right.
lightning bolt that suddenly strikes you and you have the idea. My view about that is that although that definitely is true, I believe those moments happen. They are so widely described by so many different people. They happen. They happen to me. But that's really just a piece of the picture. And I like to think of myself as studying what is the process, the path somebody follows that enables them ultimately to have those insights and those ideas. How do you set yourself up, do things so that ultimately you can have those insights, those ideas? That's what I sort of think of myself as studying, which I do think is a useful approach for managers or for anybody who wants to engage in creativity. Because if you just think it's a momentary flash of insight, what if the flash of insight doesn't come? You feel discouraged. You're not sure how to make that happen. If you think about it as a process that's unfolding over time, you have more control. You have more things you can do to help put yourself in a better situation to be creative.
Yeah, I'm completely with you on that. And in fact, in many of my writings, I talk about the lone genius myth. and it's why I called my 2007 book, I called it Group Genius. And there's a lot of overlap, I think, between the way I think about creativity and then your 2023 book, which is called Creativity in Large Scale Context. It's so rich because you do, like you say, analyze these biographies and these interviews. So, yeah, what do you mean by that? How does the notion of a large scale context, is that related to what you're saying about the process of creativity?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it took me from the first book to my second book, published a little over a year ago, it took quite a long time. Basically, I went back and said, I want to do some formal modeling of this process. And
The creative process, you mean?
yeah, but more formal. And that was a struggle. I went through a lot of things with that. We could talk more if you want to. But ultimately, the framework is the key really is that if you're going to understand how somebody develops and has their life journey, you have to understand the context in which they are living and thinking and experiencing, because it's out of our context that we identify elements, we learn, we put things together in new combinations and new connections. What I mean by context is really everything that you have experienced and everything you have learned in your life. And, it's interesting. I was thinking about it before we are talking today because you and I, we're not so different in age. We live in the same country. Nonetheless, our experiences have been very different. And the things we would have read, the people we would know, would all be different. Every single
Right.
day, we would have different experiences. Until in this moment, we come together in this podcast and we're talking to each other. But even in that moment of talking to each other, the references we have, all that we have learned and experienced that's kind of our personal context, that's different for the two of us.
So that's what you mean about context. You mean everything that happens around you in your life. Is that what you mean by
Yeah.
context? And then what is a large scale context?
Well, if you just think about that context of all of your experiences, that is very large scale. That includes millions of experiences. And depending on how your life goes. It's thousands and thousands of interactions with other people that you meet, some of whom are very close to you, some of whom are not. It's all kinds of books and articles and podcasts and short videos that you watch. It's so many things. So the real challenge is, how do we represent that context? How does a person, they must have some organizing features around the context. And then just to bring that back to creativity, if we think about creativity as making new connections, new combinations, which I think is a very useful way to think about it, it's really how, in this very large-scale context of all this stuff, how do you identify and form a great new combination or connection? And the real problem is, it's not that you can't find connections or combinations, because of course you can. The real challenge is, how do you find a really good one, a one that's going to be fulfilling to you and lead to some creative outcome that you like, that you're proud of, that works. And that's why the large-scale context is important, because it's really like trying to find a needle in a haystack. How does somebody come to make these great creative connections? How did Albert Einstein come to develop the theory of relativity? What things did he bring together to do that? How did Virginia Woolf develop a new form of literature? How did Steve Jobs help his team create new Apple products? Those are all questions about creativity and finding the right set of connections within a very rich context.
I have to admit that when I saw, you are at Yale School of Management and you have the degrees in economics. And then when I saw the title of your book, 2023 book called Creativity in Large Scale Context, at first I thought it was an innovation management book, and that what you meant by large scale was a big corporation. So what's the relationship? It seems like you're studying individual people and their life stories. You're not talking about big companies. Is that right?
Yeah, I do consult some or talk with people in organizations. And of course, if you're in an organization, then that is part of your context, and it could be a very important part. But I do like to say organizations are very complex, and I do like to think of myself studying individuals. If you are a manager in an organization, part of the challenge is to unlock or unleash the creative potential of the people working with you and around you. And so you really do have to think about them as individuals and find the right way to put them in situations where they can tap into their own personal context and somehow connect it with the organizational challenges that are around them. I see that as one way to think about what organizations need to do. And I would say about that, just in general, what this work does bring to that is, in the organizational setting, there might be a tendency to focus mainly or almost exclusively on the organization's immediate challenges. But really, each person in that organization, in that team, you'd like to be aware of their personal context, their personal history, their personal knowledge, because that can be brought into that conversation and probably increase the creativity.
This is making me think of the preface of your 2006 book. I was rereading it for this, and you say that from a very young age, or at least a young point in your career, you've been fascinated by the relationship between the individual and the social, or let's say individual and social context. And that was way back in 2006. And then in your 2023 book, you talk about, and then you could tell us about this, you talk about a bottom up process and a top down. And I was wondering, does bottom up mean from the individual up to the culture? And does top down mean culture and society toward the individual? What do you mean by bottom up and top down?
Well, I tend to think about that, about how specific or general the concepts are that somebody's working with creatively. So if you're a painter, there's lots of specific colors and types of brushes and types of paper. And I've been painting for a few years now. It was a fascinating activity. And I know you have a book coming out that's about this. It's something I actually teach in my classes, about how to see, how to observe. And I know you have a whole book coming out.
Oh,
which is
yes,
awesome.
that's fascinating. Yeah, my book, Learning to See.
Yeah.
And then your class, Creativity and Innovation, just a hugely popular class at Yale.
Yeah. So there's a lot of that stuff. But if you actually look at people who are more experienced creators and successful, what you find is they like to form a guiding concept or guiding conception at a slightly higher level, that's sort of the top level. It's not really the top, but higher level. It helps them see where they want to look for the creative insights or the creativity they want to generate. So if you're a painter or if you're a writer, I don't think too many of them just, especially once they become engaged in this as an ongoing creative activity, they don't just sit down and just start throwing paint on the canvas or start writing out words. They could do that sometimes, but a lot of times they start with an idea, conception of the kind of book they're interested in writing or the kind of paintings that they're trying to do. You think about someone like Cezanne or Monet, and they really had very conceptual ideas for what it was they were trying to do. And certainly someone like William Faulkner, Virginia Woolf, who we could talk about, she formed a very conceptual, guiding concept idea, and that was what enabled her to generate story ideas. So I think of top down as have a conception, a vision, if you will, of where you're trying to go to, what you want to do. And then as you start to generate ideas and little bits and pieces, you'll eventually see how things fit together to maybe get there.
Oh, so top down, you don't mean some big abstract thing like society downwards. You mean an intention, some sort of intention that you have that drives your creative process. Is that right?
Guiding conception is what I call it in my book. But I think sometimes, like in the world of film or the media, it's a little bit related to what's called a creative vision that somebody might have. That might be a little bit narrower, but so many examples where you see that. It's interesting in my book. Virginia Woolf is someone I've studied for a long time. We are fortunate because she left us so much material. She kept a diary. She wrote a lot of letters. She wrote essays. So we know more about her creative process than we would necessarily know about a lot of other people. And at a certain point, she was working on her second novel, actually, and kind of bogged down, I think, and a little stuck and had dealt with some personal issues. And she kind of gave herself a break and wrote a short story, actually, called The Mark on the Wall. And in that short story, she puts forward this vision of what a future literature could be. And it's a literature based on reflections rather than the actual objects. It's based on how we see each other and how through the ways we see each other, we build up kind of our life stories. And then it took her, from that conception, it took her 2.5 years really to take the next step and to realize how that conception could be turned into literature, into stories. But once she took that step, then she entered her great creative period and wrote these wonderful modernist novels that we know today and that she herself thought, I think, were very good in terms of having realized some of what she was trying to say. But that pattern is not unusual. Albert Einstein, someone who hit on a paradox literally at the age of 16, and it actually took him 10 years to figure out a way to resolve that paradox. So that's when I talk about the creative journey, that's really what I mean. There's experiences, there's forming the guiding conception, and then as you explore that, as you're guided more, eventually you find your way to your creative ideas.
So what's the message for the rest of us? So your book is filled with, these fascinating stories about legendary people, famous people that we've heard of, and your methodology, as you were describing, is to study these biographies and also the interviews with living people. How does that fit in with someone who isn't famous, right? Or someone who's just like, I don't know, small creativity?
Yeah. I think everybody can be creative. That's where I start. Everyone can be creative. And sometimes in my class, I'll have a student come up to me and say, I'm taking this class because I'm not creative. And I look at them and I say, you are creative. You can be creative. The real key is how do we open you up to be creative? And by the way, that relates to another area of the creativity field that isn't my main focus, but I have a lot of respect for, which is how do we remove blockages to the creative process? And someone like Julia Cameron with her book, The Artist's Way, and other approaches that we see, I like to think about it as everyone can be creative, but sometimes we get a little blocked. And what do we do to help somebody unblock so that then they can feel more in sync with that creativity? in terms of what I do and when I work with people or organizations, some of the blockages come because people are very anxious. Again, they may not feel they can be creative. They may feel a lot of time pressure to be creative. And I think one of the values of this framework of the guiding conceptions and how it leads to this open-ended exploration is it kind of takes some of the pressure off of you. So rather than saying, I'm going to sit down in my kitchen today and start writing the great American novel, which puts a lot of pressure on you, it's better to sit back in your chair and close your eyes and say, what do I imagine would be a great topic or theme for a story I'd love to write? Just let yourself go. I do this exercise with my students. Take away all the pressure, take away the need to do the specifics, and just say, in more of a sort of a sketch, as a visionary kind of a thing, what is something I would love to be working towards creating? And everyone can do that, and everyone can do that without feeling so worried about exactly what it's going to lead to. So if you look at people who are more successful, I think they've all had to struggle with this probably, but ultimately they're able to let themselves go, have that moment, that experience of having a conceptual idea that they could then work to develop kind of at their own pace. So I see that as one important step for everybody to take. Just to give you another story, I know the famous people are not the whole story, but William Faulkner is somebody who, in his early career, I think struggled with a lot of things. And one of the things he says that one day he just went into the room and mentally he shut the door to the publishing world. Probably something you and I have also thought about sometimes. Shut the door to the publishing world. And he said,
Sure.
and then I could write. He took the pressure off, and he had this conception at the time of recreating the Southern life of his childhood, of the past, in this kind of sort of Gothic way, if you will. And he said, that's what I'm going to do. And that's really when he entered into his more creative writing phase.
You're listening to The Science of Creativity, a podcast about art, design, and invention. If you're enjoying the episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast and rate the show and leave a comment because it helps people like you find the show. You can find The Science of Creativity on all podcast platforms. I wonder how that fits into this notion of guidance, and I'm thinking of sort of a paradox. So the subtitle of your 2023 book is Guiding Creative Engagement and Exploration. So I think about this when you think of guidance, it's possible to be overly guiding, like you get stuck on one idea and you have kind of a scripted path in your mind, and you are thinking about a linear way to get to this goal that you formed in your head. And then maybe you're just too fixated and you don't see the opportunities that might emerge along the way. But that's not what you mean by guidance. Your notion of guidance has room in it for flexibility. At least that's the way I read your book.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment, and I think it's another place where people can get hung up. There's this interesting balance between having the guidance, but also having the openness to explore widely enough to find the key elements you need to bring together.
Yeah, exactly.
I should say a great example of that actually is Albert Einstein, because he hit on this paradox. And he initially was trying to sort of resolve it. I think he thought at first, well, I'm just going to figure this out, using some physics. He knew Maxwell's equations very well. And he got frustrated. He couldn't do it. And he gradually began to see that this particular paradox actually played out in some other problem areas as well. So he kind of had that broader sense, wow, this is something really important. And then he interestingly made that flexible turn to say, I'm going to search more broadly. And he really started reading a lot of philosophy. Not everyone knows that about Einstein, but when he went to Bern and he was working in the patent office, he formed something with a couple of friends called the Olympia Academy. Really, it was just a few friends and they would read things together. The first thing they read was Plato. And then they read a lot of philosophers, Spinoza, John Stuart Mill, a very kind of somewhat unusual reading list for a young German professional, physicist, I would say, although they did like to think of themselves as intellectual, but it was pretty broad. And it was really, I think, through reading that, he eventually was led to the work of David Hume. And according to what he himself said, reading David Hume, and David Hume is interesting because one part of his book, the treatise on human nature, very early in the book is he talks about our conceptions of space and time. And what Hume really says is we construct a measure of time. A measure of time doesn't exist. We as humans construct it. Hume gives as the example the notes being played by an orchestra, that kind of gives you a sense of the time passing while they played that passage of music while this was happening. And Einstein, I think, was able to take that idea from way over here in philosophy and bring it back over to his paradox and realized, wow, the key to this puzzle is that people in different frames of reference, they each construct their own measure of time. They do it the same way, but they have different answers relative to each other. And that's how he resolved it. So it's a wonderful example of having that breadth of exploration that you need.
Oh, so I have a devil's advocate sort of question. So, and I know you have a great answer. It seems like your story is the opposite of guidance, because if Albert Einstein were guiding himself towards his conception of, inventing special relativity, the last thing you would want to do is go off and spend a few months reading Plato and David Hume. That sounds like the opposite of guidance. So how do you fit that in? I'm sure you have an answer.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Because again, going back to the large-scale context, Einstein did not go off and read just random books from the library, of which there are thousands and thousands and thousands. That would have gotten him nowhere. He had this paradox, and his guiding conception was, I need to explore areas of thought and work that I think might ultimately be connected back to it without knowing too precisely what that would be. See, the key is to maintain a sort of humbleness that you're not sure what's going to happen. You're open, but he definitely had a sense for what he was reading. And Hume, being the great theorist of causality, actually, I don't think it was an accident that he got to Hume, although it took him a while. I think it was very much of a guided exploration, but it was guided in a fairly broad way. I think that's true. So I see that as a key thing for people to learn about creativity, guidance, but with a broad, open sense to how you're actually engaged in the guidance.
It's one of the most solid findings in creativity research is that distant connections, or bringing together very different kinds of conceptual material, is more likely to lead to a surprising new idea. And you say that in your book as well. You talk about network models, or I think you mean the networks of conceptual material that, like Einstein, that you're bringing into your head so that you can make these connections.
Yeah, I think the idea of the remote associates connecting different elements is a very powerful one. And really what my book is about in the large-scale context, how do we go about doing that effectively? Because we can't try all the combinations. Einstein couldn't read every book in the library. So we have to have some guidance to help us think about where we want to look for where we're going to find the good connection. And that's where intuition is super important, to be able to have some sense for what it is you're headed towards, while still holding in your mind the recognition that you don't know exactly what it is. You sure hope you're going to recognize it when you see it, but you don't know ahead of time what it is. Another great example of that, also I think briefly mentioned in the book, but also Walter Isaacson has an article on Steve Jobs in the Smithsonian Magazine. And Steve Jobs was working with his team on, I think, the Macintosh computer, which, by the way, Steve Jobs was not the originator of the guiding conception for that computer. It was someone named Jeff Raskin. And in organizations, one person might have the guiding conception, and then somebody else might help you actually bring that to fruition. But what Jobs was really good at was the second step. He had very strong guiding principles. That's what I call them. Guiding principles are things that help you recognize when a distant element is a good fit and when it's not. And man, he was good at recognizing things that were not, and he was famous for saying no, and he was famous for saying that design isn't good enough, and the designers who worked with him said half the time they didn't know what he was talking about. But anyway, one day he went out, he was working on this design, he went on the weekend to the shopping center, and he saw Cuisinart. And he saw the way the Cuisinart was shaped, and he thought, that's what we want to use as our model for this computer. And he brought it back to the team and said, here's the model, now bring it to this computer to design the shape. And that worked. Wonderful example of making a distant connection, but he knew what he was looking for in a way, right?
Right, right. Yeah, when I hear stories like that, and of course read them in your book, and then I see you at Yale School of Management, do you teach in MBA programs? Are you teaching people who are going to go into business settings?
Yeah, the course on creativity and innovation, which is starting actually in a few days, it's mostly MBA students. I'm lucky to be at Yale where we're quite interdisciplinary, and I have students from all over the university. And it's wonderful actually to have the crosstalk between them because an art student or a literature student would certainly bring something to that class that an MBA student would be different, and vice versa for that matter, or an engineering student. But I think many of the students are definitely interested in how do we manage creativity? How do we facilitate it with other people? I always say, rule one for that is you need to understand creativity as a process. It's a process. The more you understand the nature of that process, the better you're going to be as a manager to help other people be creative.
That's a message that goes through both of your books, the 2006 and 2023, is the emphasis on creativity as a process, whether it's a developmental process or you talked about a story, a life story. And that's been my own focus as well, to think about the nature of this creative process. And I like your focus on the guidance of the process, that, it can't just be wandering and aimless, that there has to be something that's driving the process forward, or else you're just going to flail around.
Yeah, especially as we get to large scale contexts. And in the world we live in today, it's just getting bigger and bigger, isn't it? So that becomes even more important. I think in the world of AI meets creativity, which is something that has hardly begun, I think, so far. But I do see a lot of that as about how are we going to bring guidance to that world so that we can actually sort of unlock the potential, because certainly that world we can make all kinds of connections. But unless we have guidance as to where we're looking and also to evaluate to see which ones are going to be promising, it's going to be very challenging.
I have to admit that, the word guidance makes me a little bit nervous because of my own focus on improvisation and improvisationality and being open to surprising new possibilities. But after reading your book, I think you and I, our perspectives are essentially the same. We're both looking at this balance, a kind of balance between having what you call a guiding conception and then also being open to these possibilities along the way.
I think it's a balance. Even in the world of improvisation, which I do not study the way you do, but I'm sure that if you talk to jazz musicians, I've studied a few of them, they absolutely had guiding conceptions. They had what I
Yes.
call guiding principles, which is the way that they thought how they wanted to think about music that would work versus not work, combinations of notes or other things. So I think they would bring that to the table when they got in the room with other musicians. But then, of course, they'd be very open to the way the different things would combine and recombine. Absolutely.
And some of what you've written about, and it makes sense if you're teaching MBA students, is if you're a leader, how can you lead innovative teams? How can you lead teams most effectively? So as a leader, you are, I guess, you're the one providing the guidance. So what would be the message of your research for someone who's in a leadership position of a group?
Well, I wouldn't want to say that you provide the guidance. I mean, that does happen, of course, once you have a project, but I'd prefer to say you're going to help all the team members articulate their own guiding conceptions and guiding principles. And by articulating where each of us is, then we can better understand the overlaps and the combinations that might be potentially out there for us as a team. So I like to help the students think about it, which my students today are very open to that. It's very much in harmony with the way they think about it, which is we're going to work together in a collaborative way. And my job as manager is to help everybody unleash their own creative potential. So it's really about asking them the right questions and putting them in the right environment so that they can best do that.
Your approach of studying these biographies of legendary, exceptional creators, there's a long history and tradition in creativity research of, focusing on these exceptional creators, including one of my own advisors and mentors, Mike Csikszentmihalyi, who wrote a book where he interviewed 100 people, and they really are exceptional creators. And I think we have a lot to learn from talking about these people. But then there's always the challenge of, these are unique, exceptional, the one of 1% of the 1%. So is there a challenge in taking what these incredible people did, challenge in bringing that down to the reality of our everyday lives?
Again, I like to think that everybody be creative. You could be creative as a chef in your own kitchen making dinner every night. You can be creative in your garden. You could be creative with other people and just comedy, with friends and stuff. It's really more a mindset. I don't like to make that big distinction. Some people do something creatively that is recognized a lot by the world or contributes in the world in a way, but it's more important to me that everybody have the opportunity to be creative. And if we can give them the tools, the frame of reference, so they have the best opportunity to do that, I think that would be most promising. I don't see these tools, guiding conceptions, the nature of your context. One thing we didn't talk about, one of the exercises I do is have people reflect upon their own context and life journey. Because if you start to reflect upon it, you begin to realize how rich the materials are that you could draw upon. And that can help you feel that, yes, I could potentially be creative. We can't all be Charles Darwin, who had the opportunity to sail, on the Beagle all the way around South America. And in doing that, he had unbelievable experiences of natural observation. And that absolutely was, I think, crucial for developing his theory. We don't all get to do that, but even in our own gardens at home and the people we know, there's a lot of potential for our own creativity. That's something that really bugs me, is how much creativity is about evaluation of those different levels of creativity, as opposed to just let's help everybody have a chance to have that potential be fulfilled. And then we all have more fulfilling lives. I think that would make everything work better, actually.
At the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned how you and I are different partly because of our context, our life histories, and the universities we went to or the mentors that we had, and all of these things can play a role. Is there something, I guess, practical advice? Is there something you could do to choose your context? I mean, you could go out, of course, you want to find the best mentor or be hired by the best, most effective manager. So yeah, what can you do to get yourself in the right kind of context?
It's a great question. And actually, I'm just starting to think about that in the modeling, because the modeling I'm taking from the book forward is more of an iterative modeling, where as you move forward and you form some early conception of what you want, of course, that's going to influence who you want to learn from, where you want to learn, and what situations you find yourself in. Just like if you're a musician and you want to play jazz music with a certain other kinds of musicians who play something related to what you think you're interested in, that's going to surely influence you in terms of how your context builds. I remember only recently now are some other economists starting to get interested in creativity, which is great. And a couple I've talked to, he was talking to me about it, and he said, well, what I find fascinating about actually your first book, Jonathan, is how people are building up their context through exploring their creative interests. So to me, we absolutely shape it, because once we have an early inkling of our guiding concept or interest, then we begin to do things that gather materials that are related to that. But there's always going to be serendipity. There's always going to be randomness, and we should always be open to that, because, of course, we don't know early on exactly where that path is going to take us.
Oh, I have a question about how to bring that to your own career. So as I was looking at your website, not only are you a creativity researcher, but here on your publications list, tax compliance, aging, health, and economics. And of course, your degrees are in economics. So if you had this guiding conception, which was 100% economics, then you wouldn't have gone off and done studies of creativity. So is there any sense in which all of your creativity research has it fed back into the other types of research you do, the economics research?
Well, I would say that for me, in terms of my life journey, as I've begun to go further now in the last few years, and I've developed the formal modeling, the network modeling of how do we actually represent somebody's context in terms of the books they've read, the people they know, the places they've gone as a network. That is absolutely circling back towards the field of economics, because it gives me a representation that is closer to the way economic modeling happens. It's not the same, but it's closer. So I think it has, eventually I've been able to come back around and come back closer to the field. And certainly in this next step I want to take, I really want to model, again, how people build up their contexts through decisions about learning, about mentors, about projects they take on. But I see it as moving further in that direction. I don't see why these different fields have to be as separated as they seem to have historically often been. I have found myself as a person caught between these different fields in a sort of unusual way. But I've been extremely driven by working out this vision that I have. And so I just said, look, I'm going to do this. And the first book, honestly, was very far from economics. And again, now I'm kind of circling back as I begin to understand how to do the formal representation, which I always wanted to do, but it took a long time to figure out how to do it. My brother, by the way, played a role in that as well, interestingly. So you never know what different people are going to help you make those connections.
You just mentioned your next steps, so that's intriguing. So could you say a little bit about what's next? What are you excited about now?
Well, if you look at actually both of my books and you look at the conclusion or epilogue, conclusion of the most recent book, my idea, if you will, is to build a framework in which each person has unique context and a unique life journey, but have the framework be rich enough that we can fit all the different people in the same common framework. So that would be obviously hugely challenging because we'd have one very large-scale context and hundreds, thousands or more, millions of people going along in that context. Each person, like you and I, we would each be doing something different, but because we'd all be in the same context, we could talk to each other, right? We could see how our different experiences and elements are closer or further from each other, and when they intersect and when they don't. That's really the vision that I have. And I think today with the large-scale computer resources that are available, we have a much better chance to do that than we had in the past. I just would say in closing about that, one thing I love, I often share in my when I give lectures on this, there's a wonderful painting by a contemporary Southern Cal artist named Vanessa Lemon of a woman, and the title of the painting, or her statement about the painting, is, "She was a transformation manifested." She was a transformation manifested. And I love that idea that that's really what we're trying to do is model, depict these rich life journeys in order to see how it all plays out.
That would be a great name for a book, Transformation Manifested. It's powerful.
I never thought of that. Thank you. I'll consider it. Yeah.
So we're nearing the end of our time, and I always like to ask guests, could you give some advice for our listeners, something practical that they could do just in the next week that might enhance their creativity?
Sure. There's many things you could do, but I think a great step would be to just give yourself a chance to sit back and just ponder or close your eyes and dream, what is something wonderful you'd love to be working towards creating, right? What type of a thing it is. It could be in the visual arts, it could be writing, it could be cooking. And what do you envision it, not in detail, but just imagine it as freely as you can, what it would be like. And, write that down, write notes about it so you remember it. And then you never know how that journey might start to unfold for you.
Well, Dr. Jonathan Feinstein, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me on this wonderful podcast, and thank all the listeners for listening too.
Dr. Feinstein has a unique ability to master many different bodies of scholarship. In his economics research, if you look at his website, you'll see that he studies tax compliance, health and economics, and counterintelligence at terrorists. You never figure that out from this interview, and actually that would have been a fascinating conversation too. But on top of all that research, his 2 books about creativity that we talked about today, they're brilliant and they're filled with some serious scholarship. Most professors would consider it a successful career if they'd only written these 2 books and nothing else. But Dr. Feinstein is a broad scholar. I'm so impressed with his versatility and his ability to make contributions in so many different fields. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast, and please rate the show because that helps others like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.